G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back for another F1 Fantasy video. In today's video, I'll be looking at price predictions in F1 Fantasy for the upcoming 2025 F1 season. So if you're new around here and you want to see more F1 Fantasy content in the lead up to Australia and beyond, be sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. So in this video, I'm going to jump into a few price predictions for selected drivers and constructors, but I won't take anything away from the incredible content Rain from Rain Fantasy and Ewan from F1 Fantasy Pole Position have done on their own channel. So check their videos out for their 1 hour plus segments on price predictions in the lead up to the game going live, which I expect should be around preseason testing of this year. The first driver I want to look at today is Charles Leclerc. In 2024, Charles averaged 28.5 points per race in F1 Fantasy, 0.5 points shy of Lando Norris's mark, and the third highest average among all drivers in the F1 Fantasy game. He started last year at just a touch over 19 million, and I fully expect that to jump up this time around. Now, Charles, I thought, had a really complete F1 season last year. We saw those incredible wins in Monaco, Monza, Austin, and I just think for the second half of the year looked like such a complete driver in machinery that was never really the best on the grid. Sure, there were weekends where they looked strong and competitive, but for extended periods of time were never really at the same level as Red Bull in the first half of the year, McLaren in the second half of the year on a consistent basis. But I do think Charles still looked like the most consistent driver, even compared to the likes of Max Verstappen and Lando Norris. And I do think he's very much in with a shot at being a very high-priced B-tier asset. You could even make the case he could be priced in the A tier above 25 million. And I have been toing and froing on his price. I've said at times he could be in the A tier, 25, probably 25 and a half at very most, but could also be in the B tier. And going off the historical pricing approaches F1 Fantasy has done in the past, I feel like the B tier seems a little more realistic, unless of course they really want to make the decision hard for us owning Charles. Now, it's worth noting that Max Verstappen has been the only driver in the A tier for the last 2 seasons to start the year off, and I fully expect Lando to be with him this time around. Now, Charles was in the A tier for the last third of the season. I can't recall the exact race he entered the A tier, but he was on a real streak of good results, and that was ultimately culminating in him being priced above 25 million with those consistent price rises. Now, what does that mean for him and in terms of pricing Lewis and Ferrari accordingly? I fully expect Ferrari should be priced more than Charles and Lewis Hamilton, simply based on the points per million basis. Constructors typically get 2 to 3 points per million. Similar price for double the production thereabouts. So I'd be very surprised if in any world that Ferrari was less than Charles Leclerc. And I think Lewis is probably about a million and a half less than Charles Leclerc. You could make the case for maybe 0.5 million. I think if they were the same price, I'd pick Charles, simply just because Lewis has struggled the last couple seasons in qualifying and banked a few extra points on the Sunday when coming back from a less than favorable starting grid position. So I do think Charles probably has the advantage, and there's also a lot of cause for optimism for Ferrari generally. With Lewis joining the team, Fred Vasseur at the helm has really made some sweeping changes to make them a competitive outfit once again, and I definitely think that trajectory is going to continue this time around. So really liking both Charles and Ferrari as fantasy assets. This time, what that means for his price, as I said, I think an expensive B-tier asset where you might get 2 to 3 races of decent budget growth out of him before he becomes an A-tier asset seems the most likely for me, but we will have to wait and see what the developers assign the Monegasque driver. The next driver I want to discuss is Jack Doohan. Now, Jack, as we saw, replaced Esteban Ocon for the final race of the season in Abu Dhabi last time around, and he started the race at 10.9 million. I would consider that an F1 Fantasy inflationary adjustment, simply because every other driver on the grid had accrued significant value throughout the season, and he finished that race with 8 points. Now, by no means a groundbreaking result, but I am curious to see where he comes in at this time around. He is a rookie driver, despite that race in Abu Dhabi. And I fully expect he will be in a similar grouping to Isaac Hadjar and Gabriel Bortoleto. Now, a thing to note is, as I'm sure many of you watching this know, Franco Colapinto has been signed as a reserve driver for Alpine this season. And I do think there is a point in time where at the time of recording, Mercado Libre, a huge sponsor for Williams last year when Colapinto was there, has also sponsored Alpine. And I definitely think there's a world in which Colapinto steps in. There's talks of Miami possibly being that juncture. And so if we look at situations last year where there were like-for-like driver swaps, Behrman for Magnussen, etc., I think there's a world in which when Colapinto comes into Alpine, a similar price for him to Doohan probably makes the most sense, rather than scaling Doohan down and then having to perhaps have a more expensive Colapinto to choose from. Now, I think that's why I would start Doohan at 6.5, more than Bortoleto and Hadjar, but certainly not higher than any other driver on the grid. And I think it's also worth noting there were 3 drivers priced less than 7 million last year. None of those drivers were rookies. So I'd be surprised if anything higher than 6.5 makes sense for Doohan. You could even argue 6 at most, because we saw Colapinto come in for Sargent at that same price point. But I do think there's a world in which Colapinto obviously steps in to fill that seat down the line. So I am curious to see how that price factors into Jack's starting price, but I do think it needs to be considered when starting things off for the first race of the season in Australia. Now, Red Bull's another one I'm really intrigued by, simply just because you've got a 4-time World Drivers' Championship winner in Max Verstappen and a rookie driver in Liam Lawson. A rookie driver, I say that. He's raced less than a dozen races, but I still think a rookie in some respects. So last year, Red Bull were an absolute juggernaut when it came to in the first half of the season, not just fantasy points, but also pit stop points, both of which certainly dissipated a little bit when the performance of the car experienced a downturn. The pit stop points were also no longer there, and they very much became obsolete in the F1 fantasy landscape. Now, there were races where Max was carrying this Red Bull team to fantasy glory, but Sergio Perez really dropped the ball on several occasions. I don't expect Liam Lawson to be quite as inconsistent as the Mexican driver this go around, but I do still see a world where their starting price for 2025 is very much below the mark they've had for the last 2 years, where last year they started at 27.9, the year before 27.2. Both essentially dominant race-winning rocket ships, which don't really seem to be the case with the emergence of now McLaren and Ferrari in the fantasy and the Formula One landscape. They were second in points per race, but as I pointed out last season, there was that real drop-off in the second half of the season. And I think on balance, Ferrari and McLaren do have much more consistent and experienced driver pairings. So I do suspect that may not play into the favor of Red Bull, but I still think with Max Verstappen in your team, the constructor can't be below 25 million. Otherwise, it's just a no-brainer, and you need to be faced with difficult decisions when picking a team. If they're too easy, everyone will have the same lineup. And if Red Bull was under 25 million, I can guarantee you a lot of people would be starting with them in Australia. So I do think they drop a couple million, but I certainly don't see them going below 25 to 25.5 million. Now, in terms of price predictions for the drivers, I won't go through every single one. These are just my very early thoughts, but I do think, as I pointed out, Leclerc and Hamilton will be priced very similarly in the B tier. Lando and Max in the A tier are locks, in my opinion, and I think right after Lewis, Oscar Piastri, George Russell, Liam Lawson, and Andrea Kimi Antonelli are also following them. I think the ordering of the top 8 drivers, I'd be very surprised if that changed at all between now and when the game actually goes live and we see the prices. The C tier, I think, is where the most nuance is. And let's start from the bottom. I'm not going to be too detailed on where I think each driver should be ordered, and let me know down if you disagree on any of these orders, not necessarily the prices, because I've just based them on $0.5 million increments. But I think Doohan, Hadjar, and Bortoleto are most definitely locked in for the bottom 3 or the lowest 3 price drivers in the game. I think Albon, Tsunoda, and Hülkenberg, they're either the best driver in their team or coming off, a very underwhelming season. And I think Albon in particular will definitely suffer from the number of DNFs he had last year in terms of his starting price this time around. But it's this cluster of 7.5 to 9 million, where I think we'll see most of the drivers priced. Haas, I think, are pretty evenly matched. I'd be surprised if they were any lower than that 8 million. Again, another situation where the decision might just be too easy otherwise. And Ocon and Gasly have been very evenly matched in their careers and in F1 fantasy the last few years. So I wouldn't be surprised if they are, again, priced on par with one another. Stroll and Aston Martin in general, I think, are the interesting bag of goods here. I think Stroll in a car where I think comfortably fifth. There's a lot of talk around, obviously, Adrian Newey. By the time we get to the first third of the season wrapping up, I think he'll be very much involved. But again, has the attention turned to 2026 for Aston Martin by that point where there's no real strides made forward in terms of car development for this season. But I think Stroll's inconsistencies and kind of hot-headedness, lack of reliability. We saw, obviously, that mistake in the gravel in Brazil last year. I just don't see a world in which he's ever priced more than Carlos Sainz, which I think, as I talked to in my season predictions video, I'd be very surprised if he was less than 10 million. I'd be very, very surprised. I think Sainz, he's shown in the last couple seasons, he's a proven race winner. He's consistent and will be outperforming that Williams every single race week. He will be having Q3 appearances, and much like what we saw from Hülkenberg last year, make it into Q3 and kind of just sit there the entire race weekend. So I do think there's a very limited ceiling for Carlos Sainz as an F1 fantasy asset. And I look at him very similar to Fernando Alonso, who, again, maybe 13.5 could be on the dearer side. Maybe it's closer to 12.5. But we know how good he is as a driver. It's just that car. Do we get the Aston Martin of 2023, or do we get that absolute biscuit tin of a car we got last time around? So I'm not really sure what to expect from Aston Martin, but a lot will be said and a lot will be known by about the first third of the season for the team based in Silverstone. In terms of the constructors, I think McLaren and Red Bull are, again, guarantees for the A tier. There's no doubt about it in my mind. They have to be above 25 million simply just because of their history, their performance, and all in all, proven race winners in both of those teams. Again, I think Ferrari, a difficult one to price. It has to be more than both Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton, simply just because of that points per million. Points per million for the top four constructors are typically between 2 to 3 points per million, but you're paying the same for a constructor as you are for a driver. So I think there may well be a world in which Ferrari are also priced more than 25 million, simply just to enable us to choose other assets in the constructor pool and not limit our choices to the top four teams, which has very much been the case for the last 2 seasons. I think, again, I talked about Red Bull already, along with Ferrari, the two of the most difficult constructors to get right in terms of pricing for this time around. But I do think to open up the diversity and selection for the rest of the constructor pool, the top 4 teams either need to be bumped up more in price simply to accommodate that points per million I was alluding to, or make it mandatory for every single team to own a C-tier constructor. Now, I know that second option may not necessarily be the most logical in terms of gameplay, but there's just no world in the last 2 seasons where any of the C-tier constructors have been viable, with the exception of when Aston Martin and McLaren were grossly underpriced a couple seasons ago. So, I do think Haas, Williams, maybe even Alpine could be viable if there's a world in which they're priced so cheaply, or the top 4 teams are priced above 25 million, that you're actually having to make a decision around whether or not you want to chase points early on, but maybe compromise on building as much budget, or you go for a more reliable budget building asset in the C tier and ultimately try and capitalize on that extra budget growth, which may hold you in good stead later in the season. So I think there's a lot of difficult decisions the F1 fantasy developers have to make this season, and a lot of difficult prices that, I'm not smart enough or clued in enough to obviously figure out what that looks like in terms of team combinations. But I do think there's situations where the C-tier assets in the constructor pool could very much be viable. But anyway, that's it for now, guys. A very brief one on price predictions, because I obviously don't want to double up on all the great work that Ewan and Rain have done on their own channels in terms of price predictions for preseason. But I will, as I said, be back with more F1 fantasy content in the lead up to preseason testing and the Australian Grand Prix. But that's it for now, guys. As I said, I'll be back with more videos. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you all very soon.